Dr. Maria-Elena Giner is the former head of the International Boundary and Water Commission. Established in 1889, the IBWC is the federal agency responsible for managing the boundary and water treaties that the United States has with Mexico. Dr. Giner was appointed by former President Biden to head the agency in 2021 and was recently asked for her resignation from the Trump administration. Dr. Giner says she was not given a reason at that time. The Washington Post reported that Chad McIntosh, who headed the Environmental Protection Agency during President Trump's first term, has been appointed as the new IBWC commissioner. Dr. Giner, thank you so much for taking my call today.
Thank you. Thank you, Pablo. It's an honor to be on this podcast with you.
For those of us who have been closely following water policy issues on the border, your resignation came as a shock. It came at a moment when it felt like you had established a significant momentum of community building with stakeholders around some very challenging water scarcity, pollution, and infrastructure issues. But before getting into more detail on that, let's talk about the big picture to help everybody understand what IBWC is and what it does. From California to Texas, give us a bird's eye view of the biggest challenges that IBWC is managing today, and what's the role that agency has in addressing those?
We were actually founded right after the Mexican-American War. And what happens when two countries have a war and they settle their differences? They delineate their boundaries. So that's really what focused. It used to be called the International Boundary Commission. And so right now, the boundary is where there's a lot of focus right now because of the work that and the emphasis that President Trump has right now on border security. So the International Boundary and Water Commission has two purposes, as it says in its name, boundary and water. So let's first talk about water, because water is what takes up 90% of our bandwidth. The United States government is responsible to deliver water to Mexico on the Colorado River in the Mexicali region and in the San Luis, Sonora region, and also deliver water in the Juarez, El Paso region. With respect to the southern part of the Rio Grande, from Fort Quitman all the way down to Brownsville, Mexico is responsible for delivering that water. So that's a big portion of our diplomacy piece is working a binational watershed between the two countries where water and these resources are shared. The other piece that we also do is actually operate infrastructure. I call ourselves the Corps of Engineers or the Bureau of Reclamation on the border. That water infrastructure and wastewater infrastructure really has a mission of providing water supply to communities all along the border. Over 90% of their water source comes from the Rio Grande. And in the case of pollution prevention, that's what our focus is in San Diego and Nogales. In San Diego, we treat Mexico's wastewater, and in Nogales, we treat Mexico and U.S. wastewater. It's the only wastewater treatment of its kind in the United States, the one in Nogales.
You were appointed to be the commissioner of IBWC by former President Biden in 2021. Just earlier this week, President Trump has chosen a new commissioner. But what are some of the first things that come to mind that were accomplished at IBWC in your tenure there?
So when I arrived at the IBWC, there was a lot of issues. There was a 28% vacancy rate. The construction budget that the agency had been receiving between 2010 and 2020 was on average $32 million a year. So to maintain all of that infrastructure, it's a little bit of funding. We replaced half of our heavy equipment. When I went to our field offices were junkyards. They were sharing equipment from one field office to another because they only had a few pieces of operating equipment. And so much of our equipment was from the 80s. So the first thing I did was focus on that. And I asked for a capital plan and an asset management system. And I learned very quickly that they really did not have a capital plan. They had a list of infrastructure that did not work. And an asset management plan is really important to manage infrastructure. And that asset management plan is like when you have a car. Every component in your car is inventoried and is put on an operation and maintenance plan. And so you know how to repair your car at 50,000 miles, at 100,000 miles. It varies. And so in our case, we did not have an asset management plan. Everything was working towards fixing what was broken. And there wasn't even a good inventory of that. So when I first started, I had crises where infrastructure was breaking down, and infrastructure was also not meeting water quality standards. We owned wastewater treatment plants operated by the federal government, owned by the federal government, and not meeting federal law. Okay. We had in our Amistad Dam. Amistad Dam is an international dam that's ranked 11th in conservation capacity. This dam has seepage issues and structural issues that had been identified over 15 years ago and still had not been addressed. So these were the types of challenges that I saw when I arrived. So it gave me the opportunity to really focus on, one, filling positions. Two, we had almost $200 million of unobligated funds. So that we had $200 million sitting in the bank. Why would Congress give you more money if you can't allocate the money you have, right? So in 3 years, we contracted $350 million worth of construction. Our vacancy rate went down from, like, I believe it was over 25% to less than 10. I also, during that time, built a very strong communications. I started meeting with stakeholders. I strengthened our citizens forum group. These were some of the things that I really wanted to focus on.
In the days when you were first appointed as commissioner to IBWC, you were already known to communities on the border. You came from the Border Environmental Cooperation Commission, the BECC, where you were also in a leadership role. You've written on water issues as an academic scholar. You've worked across the U.S. Mexico border as a civil engineer. What was your transition into this agency like, and what did leadership mean to you in your time there?
So when I was at the BEC, what I learned in that position was working across both sides of the border, speaking technical and professional Spanish, and also understanding the programs that exist on both sides of the border. In this position, a commissioner, you need to be an engineer. You need to know how to implement projects, operate infrastructure. You need to have an understanding of the border. And my value added was that I spoke technical Spanish and I knew Mexico's programs from the work that I had done previous to this position for 20 years. So when it came to negotiating, I was able to really drill down on where the issues were. Because what a person says in Spanish and what a translator translates and you understand in English, two very different things. And so during my tenure, I was able to sign 6 minutes, which are agreements with Mexico, which is like the largest number in the shortest period of time that has been signed. And it maybe has to do with the fact that I'm first generation college educated. So I come from a working class family. My parents were working class. Their parents were working class. They were small business owners, right? The typical Latino family, right? That had their little business. And, but at the same time, I really felt really comfortable working out in the field.
And many do not know just the vast number of people and organizations that have to come together to work on something like water scarcity or infrastructure planning. What is your, not just professional life, but cultural experience also of growing up on the border? How did that experience shape how you brought all these stakeholders together across 2 countries to work on these kinds of issues in the roles that you've had?
Change comes at the rate of trust, right? And so building trust with regards to data across the border was probably one of my biggest achievements that I did. And being able to translate what was happening in Mexico to U.S. constituents. I'll give you an example. it was very easy for us to ask Mexico, deliver water, deliver water, deliver water. That has been something that has been asked for decades.
Sure.
This problem really started with the 5-year cycle of the 1992-97 cycle. And my value added was going in and saying, why there must be a reason why Mexico's not delivering water. So there was a whole lot of analysis that we did. And we determined two very important facts. One, when the 1944 water treaty was signed, we found a document that was in Spanish that was called the Oribe report that was used to testify with the Mexican Senate on the 1944 water treaty. And it had gauging station data between 1900 and 1943. And it showed to the Mexican section, if I take this data from 1900 to 1943 and project it forward, and we build all of these reservoirs, because about 85% of the storage capacity had been built in Mexico. We built all these reservoirs. We build out our irrigation districts in Chihuahua and Tamaulipas. We will be able to make our commitments of water to the United States government by just spill water we cannot capture in Mexico. That was a very eye-opening experience, because then at that point we could say, you need to manage your dams to make intentional deliveries to the United States. And that started to really drill down on what helped us identify what are some of the social issues that are going on in Mexico, in the state of Tamaulipas, in the state of Chihuahua with regards to water, and what has been a practice of managing a watershed without any gradual change through a socialization process. So that's just one example of my ability to work on both sides of the border and really have really facilitate those conversations of trust.
Mm. So, as a civil engineer, as a leader in these organizations, did it mean something to you that you were the first Latina to be head of this federal agency and the second woman ever to hold this office?
It was very meaningful to me to be the lead of this organization, irregardless of me being a woman or
Sure.
irregardless of me being Latina, right? Because my resignation letter was a love letter and was a love letter to staff.
Sure.
Right. And so I really fell in love with the mission and the people that we serve, as well as the staff. Right. So what was meaningful to me was that I get a lot of questions from people, from especially women in science saying, how did you do it? How
Wow.
did you get there? You don't wake up one day. You're not, when you're young, you're not, I'm going to be this person. I never dreamed that I would get to this position. So what I feel is, and I know I'm kind of rambling a little bit.
Oh, please continue.
I think the reason being is because being a Latina on the border, isn't like being a Latino in further into Mexico. We're like the majority minority,
Yeah.
region. So that piece of it wasn't as meaningful to me as being the second woman, having another woman in this position, and a woman with a civil engineering degree. I think that was much more meaningful. And the second thing that was much more meaningful to me, Pablo, was that I was first generation college educated. That to me wasn't, because when you're in that position, your journey to be where you need to be is a harder push.
Right.
You are required much more tenacity. You are required much more resiliency, and that resiliency and tenacity helped me soldier through the challenges that I had in life, whether it be, moving from the border to outside of the border to go to college, right? Whether it was to get my first engineering position, whether it was to get a PhD,
Yeah.
right, at a very prestigious university. All of these things, I think, are what gave me that foundation of soldiering through being first generation college educated.
Mm. I think there's a lot of people who notice that about your story and look up to it. I think that there's, yes, people in science, but I think there's probably a lot of people on the border who would notice that about your story, for sure.
Right.
The national conservation group American Rivers said earlier this month that the Rio Grande is endangered. Matt Rice, Southwest Regional Director for American Rivers, said the Rio Grande is, quote, disappearing before our eyes. Can good funding and good infrastructure restore the Rio Grande?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So so this is the second piece of science that I added to the conversation. As you know, the state of Texas in this legislation, in this legislature has made water a priority, right? And we started for the very first time a binational model of the watershed. The Bureau of Reclamation has that for the Colorado River. They have science. We did not have science. We had data on what was flowing into our rivers, but not a management of the watershed. So Mexico had their model. They gave it to us, and we calibrated it and added our information. It's not a full-blown hydrologic study, but this is what I wanted to highlight is that on our webpage, there's these links called Citizens Forum, and there's one for the local Rio Grande. And there's one where I did a presentation with my hydrologist on the Oribe report, and there's a second one that we put on what was happening to the river as far as flows into the river from the U.S. And so we are seeing that the reduction in flow coming to our gauging stations at the river have dropped 30%. That 30% is on the order of 600,000 acre feet of less water in the river as compared to the 1980s. Okay. So if you're having less water coming in from the US, water from the US coming into the rivers is 100% US water. And then there's another category of water called unmeasured flows, which could be spring flows, precipitation. That's a 50-50 between the two countries. And so there is definitely less water coming in from the Texas side. There's less water coming in from the Mexican side as well. And on the Mexican side, they definitely have grown their agriculture. They definitely have grown their consumption of water in agriculture. On the US side, that piece is not known. So if you don't know, it's hard to manage what you don't measure. We can measure it right at the river, but we don't know what's happening upstream. And let me give you an example. So people ask me, well, is that climate change? Is it drought? There could be a lot of factors. On the Colorado River, I'll give you an example. On the
Sure.
Colorado River, because they have the science, the Colorado River Treaty is you deliver water to Mexico every year. Why is it different from the Rio Grande? It's different because of the fact that on the Colorado River, it's snowpack. On the Rio Grande, it's rainwater. And so it doesn't rain the same every year. On snowpack, you have, pretty reliable volumes of snow. And you have it melt very beautifully and it flows to the river. 2 years in a row, I believe it was in 2021 and 2022 and 2023. In 2022, they got 90% of average snowpack. Great. You're going to get 90% of average runoff. They got 30%. 30%. Why aren't they should be the same. What's happening? Well, what it's been determined on the Colorado River is a couple of things. One is the warmer soils, is there more infiltration? A second thing is that the increase in temperature, more melting, more evaporation. A third thing is the increase in temperature. You get also longer, warmer temperature, more vegetation. More vegetation is a more evapotranspiration. And then the wind patterns have changed. We saw that in the Los Angeles fires, right?
Right.
The wind patterns blow the snow in a different direction now. So all of these factors are things we do not know on the Rio Grande. And so what do we need? We need more science. And what's the infrastructure we need? We need infrastructure by the users so that they don't have as much losses, lining of canals, water efficiency techniques. Those are things that can be done on both sides of the border.
Speaking of this Rio Grande watershed, we hear a lot in the news about the political dispute between the countries. We hear very little about the infrastructure needs. In my time covering this beat as a reporter, I've seen that there's a topic of water, and then there's a topic of water on the border. And the management of these resources across the U.S. and Mexico is something that has always been political. What stands out to you in the history of that, and how do you think it's brought us to the present moment?
The reason I think this is political is because on the river, what is the one number they know? The treaty says you must deliver an average of 350,000 acre feet. Okay. That is the only number that is known. My humble opinion is that is what the number that people focus on. Okay. So that's where politics come. That's one thing. The other thing is that policymakers are responsible for those deliveries from this country, right? So that's why it's been political. I think that once people were to understand how much flow is not coming from U.S. tributaries or unmeasured flows, and they had a number for that, they'd start to understand that they need to advocate for themselves with the federal government for investments. That is one of the things that I started in 2023, and that's where you can find that YouTube video on that Citizens Forum website that talks about the hydrology and the diminishing source as compared to the 1980s. I presented that also at several conferences and with legislators as well.
Right.
With Senator Charles Perry and many of the decision makers on this subject, right? The politics need to be added on investment. Hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe even billions of dollars need to go into South Texas to make them more efficient. Mexico needs to do the same thing on their side. And the difference is Mexico has increased their water efficiencies back from the early 2000s. They've probably increased their water efficiencies about 5-fold.
Wow.
What they have not done is claw back water rights. And so when you have more water efficiency, then you can water more. And so those are the politics so they have their domestic politics. We have our domestic politics, and then we have our binational politics all coming together.
And you actually authored a chapter in a book about water diplomacy right before you were appointed at IBWC, where you said, quote, nearly every dispute related to transboundary water was resolved through cooperation. How important will cooperation like this be between the U.S. and Mexico now moving forward?
So geography cannot be changed. It's like having your neighbor. How well do you want to get along with your neighbor, right? Cooperation has to be a path forward to growing the pie. Your loss cannot be my gain. My loss cannot be your gain. It's got to be something where we grow the pie and we try and develop a winning situation for both countries. And changes need to be made. Changes need to be made on both sides. Investment needs to be made in South Texas. Investment and reduction in consumption patterns needs to be done in Mexico. And so both sides need to work together on that.
Dr. Giner, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you, Pablo. It has been such an honor and a pleasure to speak with such a highly intelligent first generation college educated fellow first generation college educated.
Thank you so much.
Proud. you make your family proud and you help protect our democracy.
I
Thank you so much,
appreciate that.
Pablo.
Thank you.